think, well, if you could just briefly kind of summarize a little bit for us about what net neutrality is and how it affects people today.
A great question. First and foremost, though, I want to say thank you for the invitation. Thanks to all of you for being here. I really appreciate the chance to connect with people outside the Beltway who believe in the rule of law, free markets, and common sense, which is in relatively short supply, as you might imagine, in our nation's capital. The question of net neutrality essentially comes down to the question of government involvement in the internet. Do you believe that bureaucrats who are unelectable, or unaccountable and unelected in Washington should have a role in regulating how the internet works? And for the last 2 decades, we had a history of letting the market thrive, that government should keep its hands off, that this is a platform that was working on its own. But net neutrality, as it came to be known, one of the most seductive marketing slogans, I think, in history, ultimately led to the government sticking its finger into the pie and deciding to second guess a lot of the decisions the private sector was making about this unique platform.
So President Obama and Chairman Tom Wheeler have consistently said that net neutrality is needed to protect the internet and keep it free. But hasn't it always been open and free?
That's exactly right, and that's why I've consistently said that net neutrality is a solution that won't work in search of a problem that doesn't exist. And I mean, if you look at one of the greatest innovations in free market history, I would submit to you, is the internet. I mean, it's hard to remember now since we live in the day, but my gosh, when I was a kid, you had 3 broadcast channels with rabbit ears sticking out of your TV. You had newsprint, so that wasn't exactly the most current thing. It was really hard to communicate with people far away. It's hard to remember now how fundamentally the internet has transformed society. And part of the reason is that it has been this less regulated aspect of the economy. Compared to such things as your water company, your electric company, different utilities that are less innovative. The reason the internet has thrived, the reason we have all of this commerce, all of this free expression online, is because the government has kept out of it and just let the private sector do what it does best. And I think consumers have been better off for that. And that's why I think net neutrality in particular, at this time, was such a strange issue. It's much more of a political issue than a technical one or an economic one. And I have yet to hear anybody point out what the fatal flaw in America's internet economy was. But nonetheless, the government decided, you know what, we're going to find a problem and we're going to decide to fix it. And that's how we ended up here.
So walk me through a little bit what these new rules actually do through net neutrality, and then tell us why you voted against them.
I'd be happy to. So essentially, the FCC adopted, at President Obama's insistence, that they adopted certain rules. And I should back up for a second. So originally, the FCC was considering this issue after having lost for a second time in the federal courts in Washington. The agency tried to adopt net neutrality rules in 2008. Those got slapped down by the court in 2010. Adopted new rules in 2010. Those got slapped down in 2014. So the agency thought, you know what? We're not going to get the message, so we're going to try a third time. And so they teed up for consideration a third bite at the apple, if you will, a somewhat more moderate approach than what the White House would have liked. So right after the midterm elections, President Obama said, you know what, I don't like what the FCC is doing. I want them to go even further. I want them to declare that every internet service provider is essentially a utility, that broadband is an essential service, that the government has a role in regulating, and I want the FCC to adopt rules that were literally were adopted in 1934 to regulate this new space. Just think about it. You have Depression-era statutes and regulations that the president is asking the FCC to apply to the most forward-thinking, dynamic part of our economy. The agency honestly didn't want to do it. We are an independent agency under the law and by tradition, but nonetheless, when push came to shove, the president said, I want X instead of Y, and the agency decided to do X. So what is X? Well, essentially, we declared broadband to be a utility. We adopted all kinds of heavy-handed regulations to micromanage virtually everything about how the internet operates. Everything from how internet service providers construct their networks, to what kind of wireless service plan people should be allowed to offer you. Everything is on tap. And if that wasn't enough, the FCC also adopted what it calls an Internet Conduct Standard. And under this Internet Conduct Standard, the agency said, you know what, we recognize we've adopted all of these different rules. In case we miss something, we're going to adopt this catch-all rule that says that if you do something that we consider to be anti-competitive or just bad, we're going to prohibit it. We're not going to tell you exactly what that conduct might be. You're going to have to figure it out on a case-by-case basis. I mean, that's essentially carte blanche for federal regulators to have their say on everything that happens online. They said that anything that might affect free expression online could be under siege. Anything that affects how online startups proceed could be scrutinized. And so that's essentially what the FCC did. And luckily enough, there were a lot of people out there who didn't like it, who were challenging it in court. But you never know how litigation is going to turn out and when the decision is going to be rendered. So we're going to be living with these rules, which are now in effect for some time.
So I know the rules are in effect right now, but would you say that even though they're in effect, we've seen kind of what the final results of what this are going to be are, or are we just at the very beginning of this? And if so, where do you see us kind of going from here?
We are seeing some real-world impacts to these regulations. I always smiled when a lot of these so-called consumer activists would tell me, well, what's the big harm? And it's, these companies have a lot of money, they can suck up the cost of these regulations. We're seeing the real-world impact now. We have heard under oath from a number of small internet service providers that they are holding back on some of their network investments because of the massive uncertainty created by these rules. I think of a rural ISP in Virginia, the state where I live now, which said that we were thinking about upgrading our network from 3 megabits per second to 20 megabits per second to allow our rural customers to get better access. But we're not going to do that now because the FCC has imposed more costs on us. And it's not just the small providers. One major company that all of you have heard of has spent $4 billion less in capital expenditures this year compared to last year. And they're investing more of that money abroad instead of the United States. The reason? Well, the United States is just not as hospitable a place anymore to make those investments thanks to these net neutrality regulations. And so, whenever I hear people say that these regulations are costless, I point to these examples and I say, look, the administration is doing for the internet what it's done for healthcare in some respects, and that's not a good thing for consumers at the end of the day.
The commissioner and I had an opportunity to have a panel just like this at an internet-based activism thing that we did earlier this year. And at that time, I pulled out my Verizon bill, and I talked about something I found on there, the universal service fee. And I don't have that bill with me here today because the internet has moved me forward, and I now receive all of my bills over email, so there are no paper bills to go along with that. Can you talk to us a little bit about the universal service fee and what these rules might do to allow for additional imposed expenses on the American people?
That's a great question, and one that unfortunately is going to force me into some arcane FCC territory. But in a nutshell, a lot of internet service providers are not previously classified as what we call telecommunications carriers. And that was important because this universal service fee, which is something that you see on your phone bill, if you scrutinize it, you'll find, as he mentioned, a line item that says universal service fee. That universal service fee tax only applies to telecommunications carriers. But now, thanks to net neutrality, anyone who gives you internet service is now a telecommunications carrier. And that means that that tax is now going to be applied on your broadband bill, which means that the price you pay for internet access is going to go up. Now the only question is how much it's going to go up. And right now there's a special board in Washington that is deciding whether and how much to expand this internet tax. And all of this conversation is occasioned by these net neutrality regulations. And this is one of the things I warned about when I voted against net neutrality back in February, is that this decision opens the door to consumers having to pay more in taxes. And unfortunately, I think this is a feature, not a bug, of the net neutrality regulations. The taxes you pay under this universal service system go to pay for a lot of wish list items for bureaucrats in Washington. Things like free and discounted cell phones for low-income individuals, increased subsidies for schools and libraries for internet access. These are things that cost a lot of money. The way that Washington funds it is through your pocketbook, and that's part of the reason why net neutrality, I think, is a danger to us, but a good thing to some in Washington because it increases the amount of revenue the government's going to be able to spend.
So we've talked primarily at this point about the federal government and the fees that they're able to do. What impact does this have on state and local governments when it comes to their ability to put taxes on your internet?
It's tremendous. It's not just the federal government. Each and every state government gets a bite at the apple as well, and so they can now decide how much to increase taxes on broadband providers. They can say to these providers, look, the federal government just called you guys utilities, or they're going to tax you on that basis. We might as well do the same. A lot of states are starved for revenue, and it's the rare government that's going to say no to an additional stream of money, as you guys know all too well. And so we're seeing a lot of states now considering that. In addition, calling these internet service providers telecom carriers has a triggering effect on all of these different areas, things such as real estate, for example. The The real estate taxes that telecom companies pay as opposed to non-telecom companies is pretty significant. And so those taxes are going to have to be assessed. Similarly, the pole attachment rates. So a lot of the internet service that you guys might get right now comes over the wires that are strung on telephone poles. It might not seem like it, but there's actually a big cost difference between the cost of the telecom equipment that goes over those poles and the cost that cable companies and wireless companies and other companies pay. Well, now that they're all going to be regulated as telecom companies, those rates are going to have to go up, and those hundreds of millions of dollars in additional charges are going to be passed on to you, whether you know it or not. So a lot of these states are eyeing the opportunity, and it's up to consumers and, frankly, principled regulators alike to try to hold the course.
So I know personally, one of the things that always bothers me is when I pay for something and I buy that $99 fee, the first bill that comes is never $99.
Oh.
That's on the front page. Right. The following 5 pages are where these fees come. And I think the cost of net neutrality is something that I think we can all see is going to be something that, especially not just now, but down the road, could potentially be huge. Talk for a moment, if you would, about content. What this impact has on the content that we find online, what the government can do now under net neutrality.
So I always begin in thinking about this question in historical terms, and many of you know for many years the federal government, the FCC, had what's called the Fairness Doctrine. The Fairness Doctrine allowed government bureaucrats to essentially second-guess the content and editorial-based decisions that broadcasters made when they're deciding what to cover. And as a result, our political discourse was a lot poorer. A lot of people, broadcasters say, we're not just going to cover certain topics at all, because the government's then going to come in and tell us to give the other side a certain amount of time, or they might second-guess the very issue that we're discussing at all. And as a result, conservative voices in particular were marginalized from the debate. And when we got rid of the Fairness Doctrine, a lot of people said, this is the end of political discourse. All these crazy people are going to dominate. But the opposite was true. Now our political discourse is more robust than ever, thanks to the fact that we don't have government monitors second-guessing what happens over the airwaves. But now, obviously, the internet really is the platform for all kinds of speech, especially political speech in the 21st century. And to a lot of people, that is a good thing. And I embrace it as somebody who champions the First Amendment. I think that free speech is one of the things that has made this country great. It's unique among countries around the world that we have this promise that citizens can say what they think without the fear of the government coming in and either getting rid of the platform or penalizing them for their speech. Which a lot of people, unfortunately a lot of them reside in Washington, an unregulated online marketplace of ideas is a problem to be solved. And so we consistently see this impulse across different agencies to solve this problem. I wrote recently with one of my friends over the Federal Election Commission, Lee Goodman, he's one of the commissioners over there, about the fact that people at the FEC have said that they want to start regulating things like the Drudge Report and other online platforms that engage in political speech as potentially in-kind contribution because it might affect a campaign. That's something that should disturb anybody who believes in a marketplace of ideas. We've seen in other parts of the government too, the impulse to start tracking how online speech proceeds. Last October, for example, I wrote an op-ed in the Washington Post after I found out about a National Science Foundation project out of the University, out of Indiana University called Truthy, which spent $1 million a year to hard-earned money trying to track what they consider to be hate speech and social pollution and propaganda on Twitter. Remarkably enough, what these researchers considered to be hate speech and social propaganda was all conservative, election-oriented messaging. This is the impulse that a lot of bureaucrats and people who support them have. And that's why I think it's critical for everybody, especially the Federal Communications Commission, which after all is supposed to preserve the airwaves, whether it's broadcast or internet or whatever, for free expression. It's incumbent upon everybody to guard against this impulse because it's going to keep reasserting itself in agency after agency and in jurisdiction after jurisdiction.
I remember 1995 doesn't seem like that far back, but I remember when AOL and CompuServe disks came in the mail, and I remember when we first logged in on our at-home computers, and I remember and how long it took to get anything. And you think about today, it's no longer about the terminals in our homes. It's no longer about the laptops that we carry with us. The internet is on our person. Most of us have the internet in our pocket. Most of us spend money on the internet marketplace. And I think the amount of innovation that we've seen over that period of time is probably one of the most explosive in the world history. Talk to us for a moment about the effect on innovation, on what has brought us so far ahead, what has critically allowed the U.S. to be so successful in that marketplace, and what the effect of net neutrality is going to have on some of that innovation.
This is one of the things that bothers me the most about these net neutrality regulations. Instead of the FCC putting its and the administration trying to focus on what is really needed in the internet marketplace, which is more competition, faster speeds, better prices, more investment. Instead, we decided to use the sledgehammer of federal regulations and say, you know what, this marketplace is uncompetitive. We're going to regulate everybody from the big mega-billion-dollar corporations all the way down to the mom-and-pop shops as if they were utilities. And that has the effect of impeding investment in the network. The broadband is really hard to build out. I come from a small town called Parsons, Kansas. You're way out in the middle of nowhere to most people on the coast. Town of 10,000 people, 3 hours south of Kansas City, 2 hours from Tulsa, 2 hours from Wichita. It's one thing for people in Washington, D.C. to enjoy multiple providers with super high speeds. It's really tough for my parents who still live in Parsons to get a quality internet connection. And so when I came to the FCC, one of the things I said was, let's focus more on broadband deployment, because the real digital divide in this country is between people, especially in rural America and low-income Americans, who don't have enough broadband options, and people in urban America who just take it for granted. But net neutrality takes us in the opposite direction. It disincentivizes companies from taking the risk. And just think about it. If you had $1 million sitting in your pocket and you were an internet service provider, where would you deploy it? Would you deploy it in Manhattan, where you could get 1 million customers at the drop of the hat with a better network? Or would you spend it in Parsons, where if you're lucky, you might get 10 customers per square mile? I mean, obviously, rural Americans are going to be the ones who lose out. The less innovation and investment we have in the network, the worse people are going to be across this country, except for a select few in these urban cores. But it also has an effect, as you point out, in terms of innovation on top of this internet network. One of the things that has made America great is that we have the best internet economy in the world. There's a reason why we have Google, Facebook, Netflix, Yelp, all these other companies starting in the United States. It's because they knew that they had a platform to innovate on. You don't see this kind of innovation in Europe or even in East Asia, where you have similarly advanced economies. And part of the reason is they know that they have an internet they can build on. They thought they had a government that would stay out of it and wouldn't squelch innovation. But now some of these companies are starting to wonder, well, are we better off expanding elsewhere? Ironically enough, some of these companies were really pushing us to adopt these net neutrality regulations because they thought, well, we don't want to be at the behest of an internet service provider that might throttle us or might penalize us. But now they see that the federal government is adopting regulations that might ensnare them as well. They're suddenly becoming a little nervous about the camel's nose under the tent. And that's really unfortunate, because I think that I'm like you, like many other consumers, I rely on the internet every day for some of these cutting edge services and applications and whatnot. And I certainly hope that net neutrality doesn't disincentivize us from enjoying some of those benefits.
I'm going to take it back again. So I remember when my family got their very first bag cell phone. I remember when we got that, and it was big, and the battery lasted about 7 seconds, maybe 8 if you were lucky, and it was a sunny day. And then a couple of years later, we got a flip phone, and the network was improved a little bit. You could actually make a phone call if you moved at all, which was nice. And then after that came along digital phones. We started to see the transfer of that, and CDMA, and then we had 3G, and each time you paid a little bit more, but the old technology still existed. You could pay a little bit less and not get the fastest technology, but companies invested and they made it better. And as that happened, it brought up the bottom. There was no longer eventually the availability of the bag phone, because the least expensive phone was so much better, because people paved the way. They made the investment and purchased that. The thing that everyone talks about next is mobile. I think mobile is where the internet is headed.
Yeah.
That's where innovation is going. What does this mean for America? Will we be left behind because of these rules, and what will the effect be as we transfer from a terrestrial internet to one that's truly mobile?
This is one of the especially unfortunate aspects of net neutrality regulations. Historically, even the FCC until 2015 had thought that mobile should not be a part of net neutrality. So when it adopted rules in 2008, 2010, it explicitly said these do not apply to mobile, because mobile is a very competitive marketplace. We don't want to impose these heavy-handed regulations on something that is so innovative. And also, wireless networks are just different. It's technically a lot more difficult to channel a lot of this data through the air as opposed to over an optical fiber. And so we recognize that and said we don't want to apply these net neutrality regulations. All of a sudden in 2015, the FCC said, you know what, one size fits all. We're going to treat wireless just the same as we do your clunky landline, and we're going to apply the same regulations. And the effects, I think, are going to be severe. If you just look at the comparison between the United States and Europe, Europe historically has treated wireless and all the internet service providers, frankly, as utilities. And the difference is stark. America has 50% of the world's 4G LTE connections. I mean, just think about that. We have this tiny, we have 4 to 5% of the world's population, 50% of the world's 4G LTE connections. My folks in Canada and Parsons can get a 4G LTE connection from their house, which is something unheard of in most rural areas of the world. Nonetheless, in addition to that, if you look at wireless expenditures, companies are spending billions of dollars on spectrum, billions more on building out these networks, compared to Europe, where investment is a fraction of what it is in the United States. Yet ironically enough, Europe has recognized this and is deregulating its wireless industry. The FCC suddenly is deciding to go in the opposite direction, to apply European-style utility regulations on wireless. Where will this go? I mean, I think the specific numbers are yet to be determined, but there's no question we're going to become less competitive in wireless in the long term as a result of these regulations. You can't have it both ways. You can't have the world's best wireless service and one of the more highly regulated industries. It can't be done.
One of the things that really makes the American economy so interesting is consumer choice. And there's a story that touches on net neutrality from a company called Metro PCS. Can you talk to us a little bit about that story, what that meant, and how net neutrality kind of affected something they were doing?
This is a great issue. So for a long time, net neutrality supporters would tell us, you know what, we're not focused at the scrappy startups. We're really focused at the big bad internet service providers, the megalith corporations who are really trying to crack down on consumers and you prevent them from accessing lawful content of their choice. And so it's really telling the very first net neutrality complaint was filed against this company based out of Texas called Metro PCS, a company that doesn't even exist anymore. It was a scrappy startup that decided that the way it was going to, on the wireless side, it was a wireless company, that decided the way it was going to break into the marketplace was allowing customers to access, essentially to choose as much data as they could, consume as much data as they wanted, exempt from any data cap, essentially having an unlimited data plan. And it would exempt a lot of the services that you would access over the wireless internet from these data caps. And these net neutrality supporters said, that's unfair. By exempting some of these services from data caps, you're implicitly discriminating against other services. And they asked the FCC to get involved, and it's sort of telling that the first complaint wasn't filed against a big bad corporation. It was against one of these wireless startups that would have provided more competition. It was actually delivering consumers something that they wanted. And I think that is an unfortunate portent of where these net neutrality regulations are going to go. The floodgates have now been opened for people to file complaints against everybody, from Comcast and AT&T all the way down to Main Street Broadband, which has 4 customers, 4 in Cannon Falls, Minnesota.
You mentioned that Metro PCS is no longer around, but I think what is this going to mean for the industry? I think obviously as it becomes more and more expensive, less and less opportunity for investment to be able to pay off, what are we going to see in the marketplace of these internet service providers?
I think what we're going to see is less competition. A lot of the smaller companies are either going to cut back on their investments or go out of business altogether. We're going to see relatively slower speeds. I mean, it just follows that if you're not investing as much in the network, your network isn't going to be as fast and as up to date as it could be. We are going to see higher prices through everything from the universal service fee to those full attachment rates to higher state and local real estate taxes. Those charges are going to be passed on to you. That is going to be a fact. And ultimately, we're going to see less innovation in terms of the applications that are based on the internet. And all of these things, none of these things serve anybody other than a select group of activists who are pushing this issue, the administration which demanded it, and a group of bureaucrats who can now finally have their finger in the ultimate pie of the 21st century, which is the online world. And it does make you wonder what exactly is the motivation and who exactly is this benefiting.
Well, that leads perfectly into my next question: is the proponents of net neutrality, what are they going after with trying to get past these regulations? What was the imaginary boogeyman that they were trying to chase down?
I think that. Well, to paraphrase Shakespeare, hell hath no fury like a regulated board. And I think that For a long time, the FCC was focused on the nuts and bolts of the communications networks, radio and television broadcasting, the telephone networks, cable companies, satellite. The online world is, in a sense, swallowing up all of these. Now, for example, most people have given up their landline phones, or they're using a wireless phone to access different kinds of services. People are using online apps in the way they did before. Even for video now, I'll confess that I'm like a lot of consumers. When I think of video now, it's not necessarily a big TV screen that I'm watching, but it's a streaming service using my broadband connection. The internet is now disrupting virtually every one of these communications industries. And so the question for the FCC is, well, what role should we have in regulating all of these? Under the law, as I see it, Congress has not given us explicit authority to regulate this brave new world of the online space. And that's a good thing from my perspective, because I think that regulation can often have unintended consequences, and frankly, bureaucrats are more likely to screw it up than get it right. But to those who believe that the agency has to remain relevant, whatever that means, in the 21st century, that means that it has to dip its toe in the water. It has to get involved. And whether the law permits it or not, whether or not the economics justify it or not, whether or not technically we have the expertise or not, I think there are a lot of people who want the FCC to be involved. And you see this impulse in a lot of different areas, healthcare, energy, you name it. These are really big, complicated parts of the economy that a lot of people see as too important not to regulate. And that's essentially what's motivating it. Now, to be sure, a lot of activists will say, well, we want to guard against any potential anti-competitive activity that internet service providers might engage in. But you could search in vain through the 300-something pages of the FCC's order, and I know because I've read it all, unfortunately, for examples of anti-competitive behavior. You don't see any market failure detailed anywhere in those pages. All you see is isolated examples. A 2007 case out of North Carolina where a small internet service provider was blocking certain voice over IP calls. Or in 2008 where Comcast was slowing down certain BitTorrent connections. You would think that if the FCC is going to adopt these industry-wide permanent net neutrality regulations, the agency would have a glaring issue that it could point to, saying, look, this marketplace has failed, the agency needs to step in. But it simply doesn't exist. And so that's why I think a lot of these net neutrality activists have simply put their finger on the wrong problem. The problem, if there is one, is that we need more competition, more investment, more innovation in the network. We don't need preemptive, one-size-fits-all regulation. But I think it does serve a political purpose, I guess, for some in Washington, as we saw from the president's announcement on November 10th of 2014, to gin up a lot of these activists to get the agency to do something that doesn't really serve anybody's interests.
So Washington, D.C. is the modern day Coliseum, and I guess in the blood sport that is regulation, there's winners and losers. When it comes to net neutrality, who are the winners and who are the losers?
I think first and foremost, the losers are the American consumers who want faster speeds, they want better choices, they want better prices. They are first and foremost the losers, and we will see this over time. I'm pretty confident in that. Secondly, the losers are those of us who believe in regulators who are bound by respect for the rule of law, for an appreciation of free markets, and for the humility that should come with making industry-wide decisions. Our decisions don't affect just us in the Beltway. They affect millions of American consumers, and they send a signal to regulators abroad. Now we hear from a lot of regulators who are pointing to America's decision and saying, look, if the FCC is saying that we want the government more involved in the internet, well, why shouldn't our own government get more involved in the internet as well? This has international effects that we can't simply cabin within our own borders. Who are the winners? Well, I'll give him credit, I guess, if that's what he wants. That it's President Obama. He demanded on November 10th the FCC do this. The FCC has now done it, and unfortunately, the White House has gotten what it's wanted in this area. Secondly, the winners are those activists who bullied a formerly independent agency to essentially bow to the political wishes of the executive branch. And they scored a victory, but nonetheless, I think there are those of us who are fighting back through the courts, through Congress, and elsewhere. I'm hard-pressed to think of any other winners, but those are the two buckets I think I would point to.
Let's talk about the industry itself. The internet as a marketplace, and the companies that are internet service providers. What kind of impact is this going to have on the health of their business?
I think for a lot of them, it's going to have a pretty severe impact. I talked earlier about some of the smaller providers, and I've met with some of them. I can tell you that having met with shoestring operations, wireless internet service providers in rural areas, they've told me, look, we don't have one person to handle all the legal and regulatory issues, another person to handle all the accounting issues, another person to build a network. In some cases, that's all me. I mean, these are 1 or 2 man or 10-man operations. And so what they often say is that, look, instead of having to go out in the field and build more infrastructure, I'm going to have to sit here and fill out these forms, Form 477, which actually is a form that you have to file, believe it or not, at the FCC. Or I'm going to be the one to make sure that I sign the right certifications under penalty of perjury, and I'm going to be the one to have to do all this critical accounting. They're the ones who are going to suffer from a lot of this, and they don't have the manpower to do it. A lot of the bigger companies are going to have to do it as well. And I know a lot of people think, well, they're big companies, they have oodles of money to do it. But just remember, every dollar that a company has to invest in regulatory paperwork or compliance is one less dollar that they can invest in making your network faster, in lowering your prices, and making sure that you have the best online experience you can have. And they're going to suffer as well. All of this ultimately is going to be felt by the downstream consumer. And I can just tell you that a lot of people around the world marvel at the fact that we would just gratuitously impose these costs. I was in Europe recently. Europe, as I said, has a more onerous utility style model that we just embrace. And a lot of people there who worked in these companies were just amazed at the fact that despite America's advantage in the internet economy, the FCC would just cavalierly risk forfeiting all of that by imposing a lot of these costs on providers. They would say, well, how do you expect companies to invest in next generation infrastructure if they have to worry about the government breathing down their necks? And I honestly didn't know what to tell them. It's just more of a political decision as opposed to an economic or a technical one. And that's where we are, though.
So, and I do not mean this is an oversimplification for any farmers that we have out here today, but the farmer buys the seed. He pays for the seed. He pays for the land. He pays to irrigate. He pays to harvest. He pays his folks. And at the end of the day, he hopefully sells it for a price that is higher than what it costs for him to get in there, and that's the profit that he's able to keep. He's free to set that price. That price moves with the market. Under these new rules, the prices for internet can actually be fixed by the government. Is that correct?
I believe that the FCC's order explicitly opens the door to the regulation of rates. And a lot of people, when they hear that, think, well, great, my internet bill is too high now. And I'd love for the government to step in and tell these big bad internet service providers what they're allowed to charge. But as someone famously said, well, if you think that the internet is expensive now, just wait till you see what happens when it's free. And what you're going to see is the government coming in, essentially mitigating the incentive for a lot of these companies to have an incentive to invest in the network. Rate regulation is something the FCC just doesn't have the expertise in doing first and foremost. Secondly, we don't have the legal authority to do it. And third, it's ultimately going to impact the consumer. It might seem appealing in the short run, but in the long run, it's really going to reduce the rate of investment, reduce the pace of innovation, and ultimately be bad for consumers. It's sort of telling that the agency consistently has said, we're not going to engage in rate regulation at all. We promise, pinky swear. But when my fellow commissioners and I appeared before Congress recently to testify, and one of the representatives asked, well, do you promise you're not going to engage in rate regulation, and if so, would you be supportive of legislation that would prohibit you from doing so? All of a sudden, a lot of folks, a lot of people in the agency seem to get a little squishy. Well, legislation is not really necessary. We commit we're not going to do it, and it just belies the fact that I think ultimately that's where the agency is headed. And if you look at the context of the recent AT&T DirecTV merger of these two companies, the agency extracted a commitment while they had these companies over the barrel that they would offer a very low-cost option to low-income individuals. And look, obviously, low-cost broadband to poor people is something that everyone supports, but when the agency is essentially telling a private sector enterprise, we want you to offer this service at this price, that essentially is rate regulation. And that's ultimately, I think, is where the government would like to go.